today's webinar, Opportunities to Transform Education in a Post-COVID World. Before we get started, I would like to go over a few items so you know how to participate in today's event. We've taken a screenshot of the attendee interface, and you should see something that looks like this on your computer desktop. If for any reason you want to change your audio selection from phone call or computer audio, you can do so by accessing your audio pane in your control panel. You will have the opportunity to submit text questions to today's presenters by typing your questions into the questions pane of the control panel. You may send in your questions at any time. We will collect these and do our best to address them during the Q&A session at the end of today's presentation. I would now like to introduce our moderator, Pamela Norley of Fidelity Charitable.
Thank you, and hello and welcome everyone. As she said, I'm Pam Norley with Fidelity Charitable, and thank you so much for joining us for a discussion that touches us all. The impact of COVID on our educational systems and the opportunities to transform those systems presented with this crisis. You know, it's no exaggeration to say that COVID has disrupted the education of an entire generation of children, the largest disruption to education in history. And although the 2021 academic year ended on a high note with rising vaccine rates, outdoor in-person graduations, and access to at least some in-person learning for 98% of students, educational systems are still in crisis around the world. When the pandemic hit the United States, more than 55 million children were sent home to learn virtually, with 1.4 billion being sent home across the globe. And this vast change exposed the many inadequacies and inequities in our education systems that will have impact in decades to come. In fact, Forbes estimates that the loss of future just US earnings is at $2.5 trillion after just 4 months of lost time in the classroom. But there's good news as well. There's been tremendous acceleration in the advancement of new thinking, new technologies, new models as a result of these challenges. In addition, here at Fidelity Charitable, we're continuing to see enormous generosity among our donors, including supporting education causes. In fact, through yesterday, we're at about $7 billion having been given out to 155,000 charities. So with that background in mind, I'm honored to welcome an incredible all-star cast of experts and true visionary leaders who've been on the front lines of responding to children, parents, and teachers for decades, and of course, since the pandemic began. Please welcome Sal Khan, Geoffrey Canada, and Wendy Kopp to our program. Their bios, we could spend the whole 45 minutes talking about the amazing credentials and experiences they've had, but their bios are down there in the handout section. Let me just start a little with brief review of Sal's credentials. He's a founder and chief executive of Khan Academy, a not-for-profit with a mission of providing a free, world-class education for anyone, anywhere. Wendy Kopp is the founder of Teach for America, which is one of 61 affiliates of Teach for All, where she's a co-founder and CEO. And Teach for All is a global network of independent organizations working to develop collective leadership to ensure that all children have the opportunity to fulfill their potential. And Geoffrey Canada, who has worked with the Harlem Children's Zone for more than 30 years, is renowned around the world for the pioneering work he's done in helping children and families in Harlem and other communities around the country as a thought leader and a passionate advocate for education reform. So we're honored to have all three of you with us today. So as a team and I prepared for this discussion, you know, the reality and the magnitude of the challenges that face our education system really set in. So we intend to cover as much as we can in the time that we have and provide some helpful insights and actionable tips. But, you know, we just all have to acknowledge that we're really just scratching the surface here today with this conversation. But our hope is that this will inspire you to continue on your learning journey and also to give you more insights on how to think about your philanthropy and giving in the future to address the educational crisis. We received more questions in advance of this webinar than we have for the 7 prior ones. And so what we've done is use the questions that have come in to structure our conversation into 3 sections. First, we want to start by identifying the current problems with educational systems and what the implications are of those issues if they're not addressed. 2, we want to talk about and share some learnings, some models and approaches that our panelists believe will require a change in mindset as we approach how to tackle the educational challenges presented by the pandemic. And 3rd, finally, we want to share some opportunities on how we can all support schools, students, and educators through giving and volunteering. So we have a lot to talk about, and let me get started. Sal, let me turn it over to you. there's many of the gaps that parents and children have realized during this pandemic have actually been there for a long time, right? And now they've just been accelerated with the pandemic. Can you talk about those gaps and inequities we're seeing and how the pandemic has emphasized them?
Yeah, sure. First of all, thanks for having me, and always happy to be here with great fellow panelists. This is something we've talked a lot about, and really these ideas of mastery learning and personalization predate Khan Academy. So these aren't my ideas; these are very actually old ideas. But if you think about a traditional academic model, pre-pandemic, students are moved together at a fixed pace, and let's say we're learning exponents, and we get some lectures, some homework, and after a week we get an assessment. Let's say, Pamela, you get an 80%, Wendy gets a 85%, Geoffrey gets a 90%, I get a 70%. Even though that test has identified gaps in our knowledge, we just get a grade. I got a C- or a D+. And even the A student, what was that 5 or 10% they didn't know? We won't know. We all then move on to the next concept. The next concept that, especially in STEM subjects, but it happens in all subjects, but especially in math, will now probably build on those gaps. Even though I didn't know 30% of what happened to be on the basic exponents, we're now moving on to logarithms or onto negative exponents. And that process just keeps going on year after year after year until at some point kids hit a wall. And this isn't a theoretical thing. If you look at when students go to college, so these are the kids who are trying to do everything right. They graduate from high school, they enroll in college. If you look at community colleges, 70% of all students don't even place into college algebra. And to be clear, college algebra really should have been learned in high school. College algebra is 10th grade math. 70% essentially place into 7th grade math. The colleges are saying, and it's not much better at four-year colleges. Out here at Cal State, it's 65%. So the colleges are saying, hold on, you high school grad, you have so many gaps in your knowledge that you aren't even ready for really high school math. So we're going to remediate you. And that has all sorts of negative correlations with not being able to graduate from college, et cetera, et cetera. College algebra, which once again is 10th grade math, is still the biggest gating factor for people to finish their college degrees in America and actually in much of the world. That was before the pandemic. Then you introduce the pandemic. There's that process of that fixed instruction that I just talked about with those gaps accumulating it. On top of that, pre-pandemic, we've always had the summer slide, summer learning loss, where kids are just not only not learning, but they're forgetting. Then you have the pandemic, where you have now a year and a half or so of suboptimal learning. Those gaps have only grown larger. If you look at NWEA, they have the MAP growth assessment. Their data shows math scores down 10, 15%. And unfortunately, it's not even that bad news is not evenly distributed. Some kids have been able to learn fine, and it's actually been highly correlated with income. And then the other kids, they've dropped more than 10%. The NAEP scores are similar. And so what we think is, as we get into this post-pandemic era, these ideas of being able to meet students where they are, be able to do mastery learning, fill in gaps, becomes that much more operative. And we think part of the solution, we don't think technology is a panacea for everything, but when you're a teacher with 30 kids, they've always known that these kids have different gaps. They're ready to learn at different rates. But we can offer tools where we say, hey, learn at your own, kids all will learn at the right thing that they need to work on. They can master the concepts. And then the teacher gets real-time information and they can do more focused interventions and actually have more human-to-human interaction. So we think that's at least a part of what we have to think about, that we should also be thinking about how do you get credit for the work that students are doing so that we can short-circuit some of what I just talked about college algebra.
Good, so terrific. So Jeff, let me talk to you about the inequities that we've seen that really were in existence before the pandemic, but have only been exacerbated as a result. I mean, your focus there in Harlem with the Children's Zone, what are the biggest challenges and problems that you've seen over the last 18 months with that population?
Sal, and I'm just thrilled to be on here with Sal and Wendy, two of my heroes in education. And I'll just say, we need heroes now in education more than ever before. So we had our Promise Academy board meeting. I'm the chair of the board this morning, and our middle school principal said, hey, we have 6th graders who the last time they were actually physically at school was in the 4th grade. And it just, I knew that, but it just hit me, like, really? Like the whole 5th grade, they were remote because their families were terrorized and worried about the children and the families dying. I will tell you, as stark as Sal laid out about the challenges we're facing in education. For poor kids, it's worse than that. My kids actually had pretty decent instruction because we were teaching live online, meaning they had a real teacher from 8 till 4 o'clock, even though they were online, they would teach, there was some interaction. That was not the case for most poor children in this country. They had an hour or two maybe. There's a whole group of missing kids that nobody even knows where these kids are. They just like disappeared off the rolls. Remember, you get your attendance, you see your kids in September. There was no seeing kids in September for most of the teachers in America. And so if you actually didn't know who Rodney was, and they were on you actually never saw Rodney, you have no idea. Rodney is now among the missing. A group of our kids started working. And they had to work because parents were laid off, and you're 17, you go out. Now, all of a sudden, you're thinking about how am I going to do school? I got to keep my job. And these are real tensions. It's not the upper middle class who are facing this. Even the middle class, poor kids are up against it. And this last area, Pam, that I think a lot of us are worried about is the violence happening in poor communities across this country. So there are two things about the violence. First of all, in inner cities, it's up. You look at any major inner city, whether Chicago, Detroit, New York, Philadelphia, gun violence is off the charts. So this is on top of all the other trauma, right? The COVID trauma, kids are now dealing with the sudden death trauma again from handgun violence. But you look around the country, there are sort of mass shootings all the time. We know what happens with toxic stress in education. So this is a problem now that's layered one issue on top of the other issue on top of the other issue. And in the poorest communities, they've got the most complicated issues for us to deal with.
Good. So Wendy, let's talk about the impact of the pandemic on the international student population. You're doing work all around the world. We know how bad it is here. What's happening in the organizations in the countries where you're also supporting teaching?
I mean, I was really just going to ditto what these two gentlemen have brought to life is the situation here in the US. I mean, this is a worldwide phenomenon. And the reality is, I mean, as you know, it's like 95% of the world's kids were out of school at one point, and a big fraction of them have been out of school for months or on and off again. I mean, even to a greater extent than is the case here in the US. And what we're seeing, of course, is that the most marginalized kids are the least likely to have the safe spaces, even the food and water and funding and everything else to even have access, and of course the least access to remote education. So we've seen everything around the world. I mean, it's just compounded the inequities, honestly, dramatically. But at the same time, I mean, the kids we're talking about, as Sal pointed out, and Jeff too, like, we're not being well served by the system as it is. I mean, I think something 53% of 10-year-olds in low to middle income countries have either left school, and this is prior to the pandemic, or are not reading. And I think the projections are that will now be 63%, which is much worse, but we already had a broken system. And that one stat is so limited, right? I mean, if anything, this pandemic has shown us all that today's students need to be developing as leaders, with the agency and awareness and problem solving skills and critical thinking skills and empathy and sense of well-being that enables them to navigate uncertainty, to shape a better future. And today's schools and school systems are so far from that. So I'm personally hoping, and I know my colleagues on this panel join me in this, like, that we can utilize this era, which has been so devastating. I mean, not to pass over that for so many kids in the world, but we have seen, and I know we'll get to this, but new possibilities that there's a lot to work with as we think about how do we build a strong system that actually does develop today's generation as leaders. Like, this generation could thrive more than they were on a path to thriving before if we decide to prioritize it.
Right. So let's talk about, we've been talking a lot about students and the impact on students. Let's also talk about teachers. So teachers have been quitting, resigning, struggling, balancing their own home lives and what's happening in the classroom. Wendy, can you talk about some of the trends that you're seeing with teachers?
It's so tough to generalize. I mean, I do think that we, on the positive side, never have the world's teachers been more valued by so many. And at the same time, as you say, I mean, this situation has taken a toll on their well-being. And so, you know, when we come behind them and value and invest in their sense of well-being so that they can in turn, you know, value their students' well-being, I think we're seeing tremendous things from teachers. But at the same time, you have many countries around the world that are struggling mightily, even more so than they were before, with ensuring that the quality and quantity of the teachers they need. I mean, if anything, we're demanding much more from teachers today. I mean, it's much harder to teach well with technology, and it's just going to require a huge priority all over the world to enlist. I mean, as Jeff, you just said, we need the heroes. You know, we need the innovators, the most promising leaders channeling their energy to education if we're going to prepare students today to make the world live into our aspirations. And I'm hoping, again, that we can use this era as a time to make that call to this generation.
So there's a lot to unpack there, right? In terms of trying to kind of get at some of the, what are some of the things we need to be worried about? I mean, the stats are, I know that most students are 4 months behind in 4 months behind in English and reading, and 5 months behind for mathematics. Of course, that was just for the 2021 school year. You know, what do you see, and this is open to all of you, what do you see as kind of the most urgent issues in education right now? You know, what are is it getting everybody back into the classroom, getting people vaccinated, training the teachers differently? Like, if you just could focus on one area, where do you think you'd have the most significant impact?
I think we have a bit of a physics problem here. And by that, I mean, we have young people in this country across every academic grade who are now, you know, the testing you mentioned, Pam, were for kids who actually showed up to take the test. They weren't for kids who didn't even show up to school. We know they're doing much work. So now, again, we'll use the example of one of my kids coming into the sixth grade. The last time he was in school was in the 4th grade. We've got to teach 6th grade material and at the same time catch this kid up and all the things that they lost finishing up 4th grade and 5th grade. I think, as Sal and Wendy knows, this is where, as educators, we have just failed over and over and over again to solve that basic problem. How do we help kids catch up while teaching kids, because this is a moving target? Here I know, you know, I have big hopes for technology, but your technology is only as good as the people behind it, the teachers and the tutors, and can they actually help kids understand the concepts? So we have to grow that part of the business. I think Sal is doing that. But I think the biggest fear I have right now is that schools will get open, parents will get their kids back out the house, and people will be able to go back to work, and everybody say, oh, thank goodness that's over. It's not over. And we as educators, we have work to do to figure out how we actually keep teaching kids the curriculum of the grade they're in while figuring out all of this stuff that they've missed and how we're going to make sure they get it. That's to me is the key to what we're going to have to do. And by the way, to me, this is not a year or two that we're going to have to figure. I'm saying with people, this is a 10-year problem. We got to, every year, we got to be catching these kids up from what just happened for the most vulnerable kids in this country.
And Sal, would you go ahead?
No, I was just going to add on to what Geoffrey just said. This issue, which he just outlined, has always been there, but it's just gotten way, way, way worse. And it does require a different mind shift of how class can happen and the different roles. But there are silver linings of how it can be done. If anyone wants to do a web search, do a web search for Tim VanDenberg Khan Academy. This is an amazing teacher. He teaches in the Central Valley in California. He's also #2 in the country in Monopoly, so he's an interesting character. But he's taught for, I think, over a decade, kids in the Central Valley of California. These are all kids who English is a second language. Their parents are many times migrant workers who are brought in to pick the strawberry fields, etc. And his 6th grade classroom, this is before the pandemic, most of the kids were showing up 3 or 4 grade levels behind. And this isn't a unique thing. You go to almost any community that is serving low-income kids, honestly, even high-income kids, the problem might not be as different, but you're seeing the same issue, but especially in communities like that. And what he used to do is the status quo, which he's a great teacher. He's obviously a Monopoly champion. He's kind of the teacher we probably all would want. But he was seeing about 1 grade level of gain per year. So those kids would come in 3 grade levels behind, they would leave 3 grade levels behind, but at least it wasn't worse, because most of those kids were not even getting a grade level per year before. What he started doing, this is exactly what Geoffrey is alluding to, is he had his students do a parallel track where he had them do personalized learning at grade level, but also do what the core arithmetic sequence on Khan Academy from kindergarten. And the stuff they knew, they were able to race through really fast, but the stuff that they didn't know, well, they needed to know that because that's foundational for the 5th or 6th or 7th grade math. And what he's found is that these kids, and it's not like he doesn't do anything, they're doing the Khan Academy, he's constantly intervening, constantly working, small group sessions, having the kids tutor each other, constantly doing a one-on-one. Hey, how come you're not as engaged today? So it's a different, but he would argue, much more powerful role he's playing. And he's now seeing, by the end of the school year, 90% of his kids are a grade level ahead. So they're getting about 4 grade levels in that 1 year. So I think it is doable, but it requires a different mind shift, a mindset of how to do it. But I think it's there. And we've actually created some during the pandemic when Tim VanDenberg was like, the whole country needs to do this, like, in spades. So we created these things called Get Ready for Grade Level courses that do that in a more streamlined way, where we're telling teachers, have your kids at the grade level, but simultaneously work on the Get Ready for Grade Level course so that they have a strong foundation. A lot of people are talking about tutoring these days as another way. A lot of evidence that tutoring, even from near peers, can make a huge difference. We launched up another not-for-profit called Schoolhouse.world last year, which is about giving people free tutoring. And the way it does that is through volunteership. And we have highly vetted volunteer tutors. Some of them are professionals like all of us. Some of them are high school students, but they're amazing tutors. And so we think as many lines of attack as we can. We're exploring after school programs. I know everyone on this panel, it's not going to be one solution, but it's got to be exactly what Geoffrey said. It's got to be a 10-year. This is a very serious thing. Otherwise, we're going to see the economic implications. It's going to play out in really ugly ways. It's going to play out in economics, unfortunately, in the criminal justice system. It's going to play out in ways that none of us want to see it play out in.
Yeah, I think what you're speaking. Sorry, I think what Sal you're speaking to is the importance of, and we have no option. Like, we've got to find the new possibilities that have emerged in this era and maximize them and go all in with the level of priority you spoke to, Jeff, if we're going to get where we need to go. I think what's giving me some optimism is that, never has there been more recognition that the kids who did well in this era, whether they're from extremely high poverty communities or not, were the kids who have a sense of well-being, who have a sense of agency, who have the kind of social, emotional, and a kind of holistic development necessary to manage themselves. And I think we've never seen more demand from parents, from teachers, for something different than today's education system, like one that actually does develop students holistically as leaders who can, drive their own lifelong learning. And I think what we've seen in this era is a set of kind of mindset shifts that, if we could sustain and spread, could actually speed us towards that kind of education system. Like, we've seen teachers, engaging their kids in finally shaping the learning experience. I was just talking to a teacher, Emmanuel, in Uganda, who, in fact, Sal, to your point, was saying, we've learned learning can happen anywhere, anytime. He's got all his kids at so many different grade levels. They're not even his students. They're students in the village where he lives, and he's got them all in peer tutoring groups. And he's like, we've just learned it no longer needs to be limited to the class time that we have. We've seen teachers all over the world engaging their parents in a much deeper way and with much more appreciation for what parents can bring to the picture. We've seen teachers at every turn, even in countries where talking about students' emotional state or well-being is a taboo thing, bring that front and center at every turn into the school day. We've seen, of course, teachers leveraging technology. I mean, I think the world's educators finally, Sal, I'm sure it took way too long, but just get over whatever the inertia was to leverage whatever available technology to keep kids learning. And we've seen the incredible power of that for fostering student differentiation, student ownership for their own learning, for enabling learning to happen at any time. And finally, we've seen teachers actually engage their kids in solving the problems right in front of them in their schools and communities. So, you know, there's so much to work with. And if we could step back, align ourselves around this very different purpose than I think characterizes most of our education systems, and really reflect on what we've done and what we've learned in this era that has worked, I think we have the potential to get on a much better path than we were on before.
Thank you. So does Khan Academy have a curriculum for like supporting some social and emotional needs of students? Is it something you're thinking about, given the high need for this?
Yeah, it's something we care deeply about. We don't have a lot of explicit curricula there. You know, many of y'all know we started a lab school, and that one actually has a, you know, in the in-person setting has a very explicit focus, not only on social emotional learning, but also on mindfulness. As a bit of an experiment, I did, especially during the pandemic, I'm a serious meditator. And so I started creating some guided meditations for students dealing with stress, especially test-taking stress, things like that. But it is an area that we want to do more of. But I always point out to folks, in education world, it's very in vogue to talk about things like a growth mindset, which is this idea that failure should not be stigmatized. If you get that 70%, it shouldn't be the end of the world. You should keep trying, keep growing. But I also point out, it's a little bit talking out of both sides of your mouth if you're saying you should have a growth mindset, but you're in a system where you can only take a test once. And if you get a C on it, that C stays on your transcript forever. That's a fixed mindset. That's calling you a C student. It's labeling you a C person. We think you should always have the opportunity, the incentive to turn that C into an A. And it's amazing how many people, including sometimes educators, think that's cheating somehow. And I'm like, no, they just know the material. In our lab school, we had a new teacher come in, and one of the seniors was going back and showing his mastery at some of his, he had taken a computer science course his freshman year that he had gotten approaching mastery. And she's like, it feels like he's cheating. And I was like, well, does he know the material? I was like, of course he knows the material. He's an intern at NASA right now. Of course he knows basic programming. And then I was like, well, then what's actually inaccurate is that thing that sits on his transcript that essentially has approaching mastery, which would be kind of like a B on his transcript when he's right now writing code for satellites. Like that should say that he knows how to write code. It should be mastery. But we see this through our system throughout, and going back to social emotional learning, one, that defeats a growth mindset, but that notion of that one time is going to define you is what the source of a lot of the stress and anxiety that we're seeing for kids is, where it's actually coming from.
Right. So Jeff, anything to add to that? Any approaches, models, innovations that you're seeing that you are excited about and optimistic about in terms of addressing these issues?
Well, first of all, you know, we have been involving social workers in our schools for 20 years because we understand that in communities that have just had, you know, abnormal amounts of stressors, be it from poverty or violence or living conditions, that is going to have an impact on children for real. And I think the science on this is really clear. The thing that I'm excited about, Pam, is that I feel like the rest of the education world is catching up with that as sort of, I mean, it's as we know that if a kid is anxious and really feeling hopeless, that they're probably not going to be successful students. The fact that we haven't set up systems where we know those feelings exist. You know, what used to always upset me was whenever you would see school shootings of upper middle class communities, which used to happen rarely, now that it's not so rare. The first thing the principal comes on and says, every single one of my kids are going to have counseling. The counselor's already here. In Chicago, New York, their kids every other week they know someone who's being killed. No one does anything for those kids as if they should be used to it, right? So to me, that I think because of COVID, I'm sorry, but you know what? You take lemons, you make lemonade. We have figured out that the kids in this country are traumatized, and we have to take this aspect of social emotional development serious. And I see lots of people searching for it. I think that it hasn't been around enough so that we have lots of evidence-based strategies that you can point to. Oh, this is the way to go. But all of us, this is one of those things that I say, you know it when you see it. All of us know that there are people out there who can help us navigate through these tough places in life. And we need those for children, particular children who are poor and coming from rural communities, immigrant communities, Black and brown communities, where understanding sort of the cultural experience that they're dealing with is going to be important in helping them master a set of skills. So I feel like this is something that I hope will not go away, that we will continue to embed this in schools. I know here in the city, they want to hire a social worker for every school. I'm like, yeah, but that's a pretty big caseload. But that's a start. That's okay. We'll start with one, and hopefully we'll, support the development of, I think, the emotional health of our children more fully.
So Jeff, you mentioned earlier that you now are doing work outside of Harlem. So what are you bringing the models, the thinking, the approaches? You're trying to scale that in other parts of the country with vulnerable communities?
The one thing that I have learned during, I've been at this, unfortunately, I want to say 40, but it might be more than 40 now. Actually, it's more like 45 years, is that we have placed too much on schools. We have decided schools can make up for everything that's happened to, generations, community, racism, you name it, schools are going to fix all of that. And the evidence is in most cases in poor communities it doesn't. So our model of cradle to career, thinking that, you need great K to 12, but if those parents aren't getting great prenatal care, if we don't have folks dealing with brain development of 0 to 3, if we don't have high quality pre-K, we are starting those children off behind in a race that they're liable never to catch up. And it doesn't end. It doesn't end when those kids leave high school. That connecting kids with a set of skills, and I know Sal talked about credentials, giving kids a set of skills where they actually can get a job and support themselves is absolutely critical. So the work, and I came out of retirement to start the William Julius Wilson Institute at the Harlem Children's Zone to help communities around the country that are centering cradle to career around schools that have historically failed children, and thinking about how we bring that entire set of supports to children and families. Because, it's great if you get a great 4th grade teacher, but in lots of these places, having a lousy 6th grade teacher is going to doom some kids because there's going to be no way for them to ever catch up. How do we ensure that for every developmental stage of a child's life, they have a series of best practices, which those of us who have money, we can provide. Those folks without, it's really scarce. And so that's what I've been doing with cities around the country.
And are your organizations, and this is open to all of you, because you've got to get at the whole child, the whole student to achieve their highest potential, are you collaborating with other nonprofits to do this? Are you forming collaborative communities and organizations that are going to be helping with teaching parents nutrition and exercise and all the things that I think are necessary to get a child to their highest potential?
Well, I'll start that answer because all of our work outside of Harlem are with different organizations that already have the aspirations to do this work, and we're helping them more with the technical assistance aspects of it. But this is so complicated. There are very few places that any one entity is going to be able to do the whole thing. And the one thing I'm hoping that we can learn to do is play better in the sandbox with one another, and folks not feel like, if I didn't invent it, it's not something I'm going to promote. The one thing I've said for educators, the one thing we don't need is patent attorneys, because you can't even give away a good idea, right? People, every other business, they're stealing ideas and going with it. Here, everybody feels like they have to reinvent the wheel. And hopefully this is an opportunity for us to find excellent partners in this work and share in, I think, the sort of solutions.
Yeah. So Wendy, how are you addressing? Are you collaborating with nonprofits globally to meet the kind of educational needs?
I mean, I think we're putting really at the center of the work an effort. I mean, our work is so much about developing the teachers and the leaders who ultimately work very collaboratively with many others at every level of the education system and policy and around the whole ecosystem around kids. But I think at the foundation of it all, we're working to change the way teachers are developed so that they are oriented towards developing students holistically as leaders, and so that they're operating with different mindsets. I mean, we basically need to help teachers unlearn everything we learned through our education system and relearn a different set of mindsets so that they're approaching students as leaders. They're thinking of themselves as learners. They treat their communities as power and as kind of the places where they can find the assets and the partnerships with kids and parents and other educators to be able to actually get where we're trying to go. And they understand the challenges as systemic. And I think if we can help our educators develop, I don't know how else we actually in any sort of scalable way achieve the kind of reimagination of education that we need. And so that's really, you know, part of the foundation, at least of our work.
Yeah, and I'll
Thank
just
you. Hey, so
okay.
I want to go back to you. Go ahead. Were you
No,
gonna say something, Jeff?
Go ahead, ask.
Sorry. I was just going to go back to you in terms of, you know, one of the questions we gotten is everybody's now, okay. Everybody is now kind of gotten used to the hybrid model, right? They're doing some remote, some in person. Do you have a point of view on whether the hybrid model is a superior model for long-term learning, or do you feel like it should always be in person? That's the optimal.
Yeah, I think what's optimal is hybrid on top of what we had before. In person, I've said it, you know, 1,000 times during the pandemic. If I had to pick between in-person learning and no technology, just a stick in sand, versus the fanciest technology on the planet, I would pick in-person learning with a great teacher every time. If it's good stuff happening, it can't just be any in-person learning. But if there's a great teacher, stick in sand any day over anything else. Now, luckily, we don't have to have that trade-off. You can have the best of both worlds. But even when you're using technology, it should never be for just technology's sake. It should always just be, what's the pedagogical goal? We've talked a lot about how do you resolve this tension of kids needing to do pre-grade level foundation building while also being able to do grade level work? How do you have grade level, how are you able to do the academic progress while also having time for social emotional learning and interactions? There's a bunch of tensions where technology might play a role. How do you make learning not bound by time or space? That's another interesting question. So for us, it's an and with the real core. Now, clearly there are kids, you know, I said if you have a great in-person experience, that's awesome. Technology should supplement that or work with it to unlock it in some ways. But we also know there are kids who do not have a great in-person experience for whatever reason. Geoffrey's example, you have a great 4th grade math teacher, you have a great 5th grade math teacher. The 6th grade math teacher is not resonating with you. What do? The status quo is you suffer. But hopefully technology can raise the floor. I could say, okay, even if that teacher is not working for you, you have another place to go. And that could be going to Khan Academy. It could be going to schoolhouse.world, getting tutoring. It could be going on Zoom, and maybe there's some service that some districts are starting to do this, where you don't just have access to your teacher, you have access to any teacher in the district. So maybe you can find a teacher that you resonate with more. So I think it can create a lot of fault tolerance. And I think we're going to see a really interesting mix between the physical and the virtual. For example, going back to that, and this is also, you know, who do we collaborate? How do we collaborate with other folks? Going back to the college algebra issue, which is one of the core issues in American education right now, and it's really a very clear example of what's happening in K-12 even before the pandemic. We're having a partnership with Howard University around, let's go to Title I schools have a mastery-based course on college algebra for 10th and 11th graders, and not just the kids who take AP tests, for all 10th and 11th graders. And if they get to mastery on Khan Academy, Howard University will give them a transferable college credit, which can transfer to any school they ever go to. It's these types of things that I think, between hybrid, online, this is an in-person class that they're going to be in, but they're going to do essentially the Tim VanDenberg model. They're going to leverage technology, but that teacher is going to be there and actually going to interact more with the students than that teacher might have done if they were doing a traditional lecture-based fixed pace type of instruction. And then we're also partnering with the in-person universities to say, how do we connect the dots here so that we just short circuit the system in a good way?
Yeah, I mean, these are seismic shifts in the infrastructure, right? I mean, in other words, if I don't like my sixth grade teacher, basically it's like, I've just got to get through. And if you have means, you've got your parents in advocating for a change, but that's almost impossible to do. So this is really kind of educating about the value of other methodologies and approaches that can be used to try to get at, the opportunity to train that child. So no, that's fascinating. So let me kind of end here, because we are running out of time, as I suspected that we would, is, how can our donors get involved right now from a national and a local perspective? Are there things that you would recommend that they get involved in? I mean, our donors are very curious. They want to learn more. There's things that they can be doing now to get more informed so they can help transform and bring us through this maybe in less than 10 years, Jeff. Is it dollars? I mean, it's, we've got $200 billion from the government.
I don't think, I think I can speak for the other two folks on the Zoom call to say that, yeah, dollars matter. And we certainly think that, this is a problem that's going to take resources to get the problem fixed. But there are a couple of other things that I think are really critical. When you think about school, you think about governance. And when you think about governance, you have to think about school boards. And folks just ignore the power that school boards have. And they can really shape the experience of a generation of children. And so I think that's something folks should really look at. How do you support school boards that are sort of mastering the kind of technology and educational outcomes that a bunch of us are talking about? And then I think there is something about supporting innovation through a transition of government. Almost immediately when a new mayor, they want to wipe out everything and start all over again. That's been happening in education ever since I've been in it. So often things that are started never get enough time to work. And I think trying to figure out what's really evidence-based, what is it that's working and why is really critical. And people should push these political systems to not throw out the baby with the bathwater when it comes time to change, because all the governments are going to change. I mean, that's the one thing we know. There are going to be new mayors, new governors, new presidents. We need some education systems in place that continue regardless.
What I would say, Pamela, is, I mean, I would encourage people to also think globally. I mean, it's never been more apparent, I think, to all of us that our fates are completely interconnected. It matters so much that kids all around the world are attaining the kind of education that we're talking about here. And what we've learned across Teach for All is that we can move a lot faster if we're learning across borders in education. So to Jeff's point, like, we should right now be funding the innovations and the people, not only in this country, but all around the world, who are working to build forward much better and to reimagine the system, because if we don't do that, we won't meet any of the rest of our aspirations for sustainability, for equity, for peace. So I would just say prioritize education and think globally as well as locally and nationally.
Thank you. And Sal?
Yeah, as Jeff said, the resources do make a difference, and many folks here are probably familiar with investing in the for-profit realm. And if you can get a 20-30% return on equity, that's considered a home run.
Right.
I think I can speak for everyone here. I think any of these efforts, especially in the time we're in this post-pandemic, the social return on investment is measured in the tens of thousands of percent. I can speak on, we've actually done the calculation for ourselves, budget of large high school reaching over 100 million folks. You know, it's 500x, 1000x, and these are all very important but different parts that are also very complementary, right? It's, you know, the work that Geoffrey's done at the Harlem Children's Zone, it's working there, but then it creates an archetype for the rest of the world. The stuff that Wendy's done in the US and globally around up-leveling the teachers, that's so central to everything. And obviously we're connected to everything that they want to do, but we want to provide the core tools. We want to raise the floor globally for anyone. We have a young girl in Afghanistan, Taliban keeps her from going to school. She can keep learning, but we can also keep the kids at Harlem Children's Zone or whoever we're working with. So if they have it, so that the ceiling ideally goes up, but that we can also raise the floor. I'd also say, you know, we're always open to conversations about everyone here could actually tutor if they like on schoolhouse.world. There's a whole system for it. If you have high school age kids or middle school kids, they can get free tutoring. But also I encourage them to think about becoming tutoring. A lot of universities are starting to look at this as a way to vet kids. If you can tutor algebra, if you can tutor statistics, that's more impressive in many cases than having a high GPA or high standardized test scores. So look at that. We're also trying to convince employers. So many people, if you reach out to me or any of us, around, hey, if you want to hire kids, young people, college students who can tutor statistics or who show mastery in something, we want to have that conversation. But I would be remiss if the dollars make a big difference. I think every one of our organizations could run that much faster and reach that many more people if we weren't rate limited there.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that. And I am so grateful for your insights and more importantly for your leadership of your organizations at this time. I think I speak for all of the audience here that we have had just an unbelievable epiphany of kind of the opportunities and the challenges. But I think I have an enormous amount of optimism to see people like you leading teams around the world to try to address and get after these issues. So thank you so much for your time today. For those of you who joined us, thank you so much for your time. We're going to be sending a video of this back to you along with some additional educational materials from all of our panelists. And I wish you all well. Thank you very much. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks you all.